On November 30th, 1939, nearly 500,000 Soviet soldiers stormed across the Finnish border. Joseph Stalin was confident. The numbers spoke for themselves. 750,000 Red Army troops against Finland's 300,000 defenders. 6,000 Soviet tanks against Finland's handful of armored vehicles. 3,000 aircraft against barely 100. The Soviet leader expected to conquer Finland in weeks, perhaps days. He even had a communist puppet government ready to install in Helsinki. But something went catastrophically wrong in those frozen forests. Soviet commanders, accustomed to overwhelming enemies with superior firepower and numbers, found themselves fighting an enemy they could not see, could not catch, and could not defeat. Entire divisions vanished into the snow. Columns of tanks and trucks became frozen graveyards. Soviet soldiers, many from warmer southern regions, froze to death in temperatures that plunged to minus 43 degrees Celsius. They called their invisible killers Belia Smrt, the White Death. The Winter War would become one of the most shocking military disasters in Soviet history. It exposed the catastrophic effects of Stalin's Great Purge, which had executed or imprisoned two-thirds of the Red Army's senior commanders just 2 years earlier. It revealed an army unprepared, poorly led, and completely unsuited for winter warfare. But most terrifyingly for Soviet commanders, it introduced them to an enemy unlike any they had faced. Finnish ski troops who moved like ghosts through forests they had known since childhood, who could survive and fight in conditions that killed Soviet soldiers by the thousands, and who turned the brutal winter itself into a weapon. The frozen killing ground. The Karelian Isthmus and the forests north of Lake Ladoga became a nightmare for Soviet forces from the first day of the invasion. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was one of the coldest in recorded history. Snow accumulated to depths of 2 meters. Lakes and rivers that should have been obstacles froze solid. But this worked against the Soviets rather than for them. Their heavy tanks and artillery could move across frozen terrain, but their troops, most of whom had received little or no winter warfare training, suffered catastrophically. Finnish soldiers, by contrast, had lived their entire lives in these conditions. They were hunters, loggers, and farmers who had skied since childhood. They knew every trail, every ridge, every frozen stream. When temperatures dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius, Soviet soldiers froze in their positions, their weapons jamming from the cold, their vehicles refusing to start. Finnish troops merely adjusted their layers, checked their equipment, and continued operations. The Finns had prepared for this moment. They wore white camouflage, often improvised from bed sheets, that made them nearly invisible against the snow. They moved on skis with a speed and silence that Soviet soldiers could not match. Many Soviet troops, wearing dark khaki uniforms, stood out like targets against the white landscape. Their formations, trained for conventional warfare on open terrain, became death traps in the dense forests. The Finnish strategy was born of necessity. They could not meet the Soviets in open battle, the numbers made that suicidal. Instead, they would use the terrain, the weather, and their superior mobility to wage a war of attrition. Small units of Finnish ski troops would strike Soviet columns, then vanish into the forests before reinforcements could arrive. They attacked at night, when Soviet soldiers clustered around campfires for warmth, making themselves easy targets. Soviet officers quickly learned to fear the forests. Their maps showed roads cutting through seemingly empty wilderness, but those roads became killing corridors. Finnish soldiers would let Soviet columns advance deep into the forest, then strike simultaneously at the front and rear, trapping thousands of men with nowhere to retreat. The Finns had turned Finland itself into a weapon, and Soviet commanders had no answer for it. The Mahti tactic, cutting wood, cutting armies. The word Mahti refers to a cubic meter of firewood in Finnish. By December 1939, it had taken on a much darker meaning. It described what Finnish troops did to Soviet columns in the forests north of Lake Ladoga. They would slice them apart, segment by segment, like chopping wood for winter. Then they would destroy each isolated piece methodically, completely. The Battle of Suomussalmi demonstrated Mahti tactics at their most devastating. The Soviet 163rd Rifle Division advanced along the road toward Suomussalmi, confident in their numbers and firepower. Colonel Jalmar Salasvuo and his Finnish 9th Division watched them come. The Soviets moved in a long, winding column, tanks, artillery, trucks, thousands of infantry, all confined to the narrow forest road because the deep snow made off-road movement impossible for their heavy equipment. Salasvuo struck with precision. Finnish ski troops cut the column at multiple points simultaneously, using felled trees to block the road. What had been one massive formation became dozens of isolated pockets, mahtis, each surrounded by Finnish positions. The Soviets, trapped and unable to maneuver, tried to fight their way out. But Finnish troops, moving freely through the forests on skis, could concentrate overwhelming force on one mahti, destroy it, then move to the next. The destruction of the Soviet 44th Motorized Division at the Battle of Rate Road was even more catastrophic. Approximately 14,000 Soviet troops marched to reinforce their beleaguered comrades at Suomussalmi. They never made it. Finnish forces ambushed the entire division, cut it into mahtis, and then spent days methodically destroying each pocket. Soviet troops fought bravely. They entrenched their tanks to use as pillboxes, built timber dugouts, and held out in desperate conditions. But they were fighting an enemy that appeared and disappeared like smoke, that struck when they were weak, and that knew the terrain intimately. When Finnish troops finally overran the last Soviet positions, they found scenes of horror. Thousands of frozen Soviet soldiers lay in the snow, many having died from exposure rather than wounds. The Finns captured dozens of tanks, hundreds of trucks, thousands of rifles, and desperately needed ammunition. So confident had the Soviets been of victory that a military band had been traveling with the 44th Division, ready to perform in the captured Finnish city of Oulu. Their instruments lay frozen in the snow alongside the dead soldiers. Soviet commanders tried to adapt. They brought in more troops, more artillery, more tanks. But in the forests, numbers meant little. A Soviet division confined to a road was merely a longer target. Finnish soldiers, operating in small, mobile units, could move through terrain the Soviets considered impassable. They would appear behind Soviet lines, destroy supply depots and field kitchens, then vanish before reinforcements arrived. Soviet soldiers, already demoralized by the cold and the endless casualties, began to fear that their enemies were supernatural beings, ghosts that could not be fought with conventional weapons. The White Death and the individual warriors. Among the Finnish defenders, one man became the embodiment of Soviet fears. His name was Simo Haiha, a farmer and hunter from Rotjärvi. He stood just 5 feet 3 inches tall. Between November 1939 and March 1940, he killed over 500 Soviet soldiers. The Red Army called him the White Death, though some historians suggest that term originally referred to the killing frost itself. Either way, Haiha became the most lethal sniper in military history. Haiha's methods were simple but devastatingly effective. He used a Finnish M28-30 rifle, a variant of the Mosin-Nagant, but he refused to use a telescopic sight. Scopes could fog up in the extreme cold, and they could reflect sunlight, revealing a sniper's position. Instead, Haiha relied on iron sights, shooting at targets up to 400 meters away with extraordinary accuracy. He could estimate distances within 1 meter. Every morning before dawn, Haiha would ski to his position, dig a shallow pit in the snow, and wait. He wore complete white camouflage and positioned himself to minimize his profile. He would pack snow around his position for additional concealment and place snow in front of his rifle's muzzle, so that the blast would not kick up a telltale cloud. He even kept snow in his mouth so his breath would not create visible vapor in the freezing air. Then he would wait, absolutely motionless, for hours. Soviet soldiers advancing through the forests had no warning. One moment they were trudging through the snow, the next moment the man beside them would drop dead. No sound, no flash, nothing to indicate where the shot had come from. Haiha could fire and kill, then remain completely still as Soviet troops searched frantically for the shooter. He would fire again only when they gave up and continued moving. In one day he killed 25 men. The Soviet command, desperate to stop the White Death, sent their own snipers to hunt him. They failed. They directed artillery strikes at areas where they thought he might be hiding. They used infantry squads to sweep the forests. Nothing worked. Haihare's intimate knowledge of the terrain, his extraordinary patience, and his absolute discipline made him nearly impossible to find. On March 6, 1940, just days before the war ended, an explosive bullet finally struck Haiha in the jaw, fired by a dying Soviet soldier in a chance shot. The wound destroyed half his face. He fell into a coma for 11 days and woke up as the peace treaty was being signed. Haiha was only the most famous of thousands of Finnish soldiers who became expert winter fighters. Many were hunters and loggers who had spent their entire lives in the forests. They knew how to move silently on skis, how to read the terrain, how to survive in conditions that killed others. For them, the winter was not an enemy but an ally. For Soviet soldiers from Ukraine, Russia, and Central Asia, many of whom had never seen such cold or such snow, it was a nightmare from which there was no waking. The Soviet catastrophe and desperate adaptations. Soviet losses in the Winter War were staggering. Official Soviet figures, released only after the collapse of the USSR, admitted to 126,875 dead. Finnish estimates put the number closer to 200,000. Another 264,000 Soviet soldiers were wounded, and at least 61,506 suffered frostbite or cold-related illnesses. Entire divisions ceased to exist. The 44th Motorized Division lost somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 men at Rate Road alone. The 163rd Rifle Division was virtually destroyed. The disaster stemmed from multiple failures. Stalin's Great Purge had gutted the Red Army's leadership. Between 1937 and 1938, approximately 11,000 officers were executed, imprisoned, or dismissed. Two-thirds of all commanders at the brigade, division, and army level were killed. The survivors were often promoted far beyond their competence. Young officers who should have been commanding companies found themselves leading divisions. They had no experience and no mentors to guide them. The Red Army's tactical doctrine, designed for the open plains of Eastern Europe, collapsed in the Finnish forests. Soviet commanders threw massive formations at Finnish positions, expecting their superior numbers to overwhelm the defenders. Instead, they created target-rich environments for Finnish ambushes. Soviet troops advanced in column along roads because their heavy equipment could not move through the deep snow. This made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of encirclement tactics the Finns employed. Soviet soldiers were poorly equipped for winter warfare. Many lacked proper cold-weather clothing. Their weapons, especially their automatic rifles, jammed in the extreme cold. Their vehicles would not start without running the engines for 15 minutes every 2 hours, consuming precious fuel. Their field kitchens, essential for keeping troops warm and fed, became priority targets for Finnish raiders. A Soviet soldier without hot food in -40-degree temperatures could die of exposure within hours. By February 1940, after 3 months of catastrophic losses, the Soviet command finally began to adapt. They brought in new commanders, including Marshal Timoshenko, who reorganized the assault. They concentrated massive artillery bombardments on Finnish positions before infantry attacks. They brought in fresh divisions and better winter equipment. Most importantly, they learned to avoid the forests where Mahdi tactics had devastated their forces. Instead, they concentrated their attacks on the Mannerheim Line, the Finnish defensive fortifications across the Karelian Isthmus. The new Soviet strategy worked, but at horrific cost. They threw 460,000 men, 3,350 artillery pieces, 3,000 tanks, and 1,300 aircraft against the Mannerheim Line. They carpet-bombed Finnish positions and launched wave after wave of frontal assaults. Finnish defenders, exhausted after months of fighting and running low on ammunition, finally began to give way. On March 13, 1940, Finland signed the Treaty of Moscow, ceding 11% of its territory to the Soviet Union but maintaining its independence. Legacy of fear and lessons learned. The Winter War ended in Soviet victory, but it was a victory that exposed catastrophic weaknesses. The Red Army had lost somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 men, conquering a nation 1/40th its size. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev later admitted the truth. All of us, and Stalin first and foremost, sensed in our victory a defeat by the Finns. The world took notice. Adolf Hitler, planning his own invasion of the Soviet Union, looked at the Winter War results and concluded that the Red Army was a broken force that could be destroyed in a single campaign. This catastrophic miscalculation would contribute to Operation Barbarossa in 1941 and the deaths of millions. But Hitler missed the real lesson. He saw Soviet weakness and did not recognize Finnish strength. The Finnish achievement was extraordinary. A nation of 4 million people had fought a country of 150 million to a standstill. They had inflicted losses at a ratio approaching 10-1 in some battles. They had demonstrated that superior numbers and equipment meant nothing if troops could not adapt to their environment, if commanders could not devise effective tactics, and if soldiers lacked the will to fight. The Mahdi tactic became studied in military academies worldwide. The principle was simple but required conditions many armies could not replicate: intimate knowledge of terrain, superior mobility, and soldiers capable of operating independently in small units. Finnish ski troops could execute Mahdi operations because they had grown up in those forests, because they could navigate and survive in conditions that killed others, and because they understood their mission without needing constant direction from officers. The legacy of the White Death and the White Ghosts of the Finnish forests lives on. Finland maintained its independence throughout World War II and the Cold War, never becoming a Soviet satellite state. The Finnish military continued to emphasize winter warfare training, and Finnish soldiers remained among the world's best in Arctic conditions. The lessons of the Winter War influenced military doctrine in countries from Norway to Canada to the United States. For the Soviet Union, the Winter War was a brutal teacher. The Red Army reformed its training, improved its winter equipment, and learned bitter lessons about the cost of poor leadership. When Germany invaded in June 1941, Soviet forces initially collapsed, but they remembered how to fight in winter. The Red Army that stopped the Wehrmacht at Moscow, Stalingrad, and Leningrad had learned from the frozen forests of Finland. The Finnish soldiers who fought in the Winter War never saw themselves as heroes. Simo Häyhä, when asked in 2001 if he felt remorse for killing so many men, replied simply, "I did what I was told to do as best as I could. There would be no Finland if everyone else had not done the same." That sense of duty, combined with extraordinary skill and courage, had enabled a small nation to defy one of the world's great powers. In the end, Soviet commanders feared Finland's white ghosts because those ghosts represented something their massive army could not overcome. Soldiers fighting for their homeland, in terrain they knew intimately, using tactics adapted perfectly to their environment. The Finns had transformed their greatest weakness, their small numbers, into an advantage by making the winter itself their ally. In the killing cold of those forests, where temperatures dropped to -40 degrees and below, they proved that sometimes the smallest army, if skilled enough and determined enough, can defeat forces many times its size. The frozen forests of Finland had taught the Soviet Union a lesson written in blood and ice. There are some enemies that cannot be defeated by numbers alone, some terrain where conventional tactics lead only to disaster, and some soldiers who, when fighting for their survival, become more dangerous than any ghost.